This is the download recap from Sounds Profitable, the most important news from this week and why it matters to people in the business of podcasting. I'm Gavin Gaddis. Download recap is brought to you by Podscribe. You can find out more at podscribe.com. Now, let's get into this week's news. Why the argument for not investing in UK podcast advertising just ran out of road by Ben Robbins. UK podcast ads prove to have significant reach and power at a lower price than expected. New research from Sound Insights and Sounds Profitable finds UK podcast advertising priced far below the audience it actually reaches, at roughly 18 pence per listener hour versus 94 pence in the US, a 5.2 times gap, even though the two markets deliver comparable reach and attention. Podcasts reached 43% of UK adults in the past month, and 79% of daily UK podcast users recalled hearing a podcast ad in the past week. The recall advantage is sharpest among the audience advertisers pay the most to reach. Among 18 to 34-year-olds, podcast ad recall hit 86%, higher than the 83% who recalled broadcast TV advertising over the same period. Female listeners also converted at higher rates, with 34% visiting a brand's website after hearing an ad versus 27% of men. A quote from Robbins, quote, "The audience agencies are spending enormous budgets to reach on television is recalling podcast advertising at a higher rate than they are recalling television advertising." End quote. Robbins frames that gap as a first-mover pricing window that closes as UK measurement matures and rates normalize. The Podcast Atlas Part 4, The Denominator, by Tom Webster. Social platforms function as the base from which podcast advertising grows, argues Tom Webster in the fourth installment of the Podcast Atlas. YouTube reaches 82% of podcast listeners in a month, and Facebook reaches 80% against 36% for all of audio podcasting, which is why Webster frames social as the foundation of distribution rather than a secondary channel. Those platforms are podcast surfaces in their own right now, with 37% of listeners consuming podcast content on Facebook, ahead of Spotify at 28% and Apple Podcasts at 18%. Webster separates the roles by strength, with audio building trust and belief, while social delivers frequency and retargeting. The ad experience itself varies widely by platform, with YouTube drawing the weakest ad sentiment and TikTok the highest immediate purchase rate, which is why he argues the two channels should be planned together rather than pitted against each other, with social reach serving as the number every campaign multiplies against. Quote, "Rates are numerator arguments, and podcasting wins nearly all of them. Social platforms win almost none, and it doesn't matter because social isn't competing on the numerator. Social is the denominator." End quote. Comscore wants to make buying podcast ads feel more like buying CTV or display. Comscore expanded its Proximic contextual targeting to 5 major audio platforms: Spotify, SiriusXM, Triton Digital, Acast, and Libsyn. The expansion enables episode-level contextual targeting of podcast inventory. By automating transcription and packaging it into pre-bid audience segments, advertisers can now buy podcast ads through the same programmatic tools they already use for connected TV and display. This addresses a long-standing friction point for buyers unfamiliar with audio workflows. Here's a quote from Jessica Traynor, head of partnerships at Proximic by Comscore. Quote, "It's putting audio a little bit more at parity with some of the other channels that buyers are used to targeting on." End quote. Copy Starbucks barista program, inherit a labor bill nobody has priced. As brands race to turn employees into on-camera creators, Steve Raizes argues in his Media Built newsletter that companies copying programs like Starbucks' new Green Apron creators are taking on obligations they might not have priced. He walks through the legal landmines of codifying content creation on the clock. Copyright ownership is unsettled for work filmed off-shift on personal devices, where platforms publish terms and employers rarely do. Payroll exposure grows once rewards carry defined criteria, which Labor Department opinions indicate can trigger overtime recalculations across all earnings. Review capacity becomes its own cost, since 2,000 creators submitting monthly content means you could have more than 333 hours of review before rights clearance and FTC disclosure checks. Two more details can catch employers off guard. Federal labor protections shield employees who discuss wages and working conditions, which programs with terms demanding positivity may run against, and likeness rights outlast employment. Raisies points to a podcast producer who drifted into on-air talent as a show grew and got answers on compensation and ownership before the money scaled. The model he recommends, quote, "Nobody has been sued over any of this yet, which is exactly the reason to write the terms now instead of after." End quote. For the final top story, podcast buying evolves as creators build cross-platform brands. Podcast advertisers are increasingly looking past download counts to weigh a creator's influence across YouTube, social media, video, and live events, according to Acast U.S. sales chief Richard Netto. Mid-tier creators clearing roughly 50,000 weekly downloads are drawing buyer attention once their cross-platform reach is counted, and host-read deals are evolving into wider partnerships spanning branded content, product placement, and events. Here's a quote from Netto, quote, "The definition of podcast has changed from just this traditional RSS experience to now social and video and experiential," end quote. This reframing lifts the value of highly engaged niche shows long priced on just downloads alone. Now it's time for quick hits. These are articles that didn't fit into the top story section today, but are still worth including in your weekend reading. First up, IB Tech Lab has opened a 30-day public comment period from now through August 19th on its podcast technical measurement guidelines version 2.3, adding guidance on URL prefix measurement, duplicate downloads, and invalid traffic, and retiring the term listener for podcast consumer with a streaming video-focused version 3.0 due in 2027. The Roost Podcast Network has rebranded to Podium. Red Seat Ventures brought its roster of more than 40 premium creators to Amazon DSP, giving advertisers programmatic access to creator-led audio and video podcasts, reaching tens of millions monthly unique listeners. Stephen Goldstein profiled higher education's fast-growing podcasting community, where success is measured by influence rather than chart rank, anchored by the Higher Ed PodCon conference and roughly 214 member organizations that produce over 1,600 shows. And finally, here's a fun one to end things out. The Podcast Guys deleted their 6-year-old YouTube channel, and it has been relaunched, a public lesson on building audiences with honest numbers. This also comes with a set-in-stone list of goals for how many subscribers the YouTube channel should have by the end of the year. That was The Download, brought to you by Sounds Profitable. I go through the stories fast, so remember, there's a link in your show notes that takes you to our website post version of this episode with all of the links to every article I just talked about. You can also subscribe to get future editions of The Download sent straight to your email inbox. As usual, our producers are myself, Brian Barletta, Molly Demillier, and Tom Webster. And special thanks to you for sticking with me as I brought you all the top stories you might have missed from this past week. Robot?
Download complete.